It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Property Podcast. We've got a great episode for you this week. But before we start, I hope you're all enjoying the heat, if we still have it, or is summer over? I do not know because we record this a few days behind. Rob, you're in sunny Liverpool.
Yeah, I am, and it is actually sunny, but it's not. Apparently in London, everyone's telling me that everything's literally melting and falling apart and everyone's collapsing. Up here, it's just nice and they've got a pleasant Mersey breeze and the sun's out. So I think I'm in the right place today.
Well, back to front. You're from Hertfordshire and I'm from Liverpool.
Yeah.
And you're in Liverpool and I'm in Hertfordshire. So we're a bit mixed up, but hopefully we will not get mixed up with our main piece this week, which is the 18-year property cycle. And we'll talk more about that shortly. But Rob, it feels like we haven't done a podcast in ages. If you're listening, you've seen quite a few weeks. But I've been on holiday and we recorded a few before I went because obviously we always get the podcast out every week. We're dedicated. But has anything been going on?
Oh, this and that. I mean, again, we're getting mixed up because I thought I'm meant to be the one who's away, and yeah, I'm in the UK and you've been away, so it's all back to front. But yeah, there's been a few things going on, Rob, a few things to talk about, but it's all good. And I hope you're coming back refreshed and ready to hit it hard and get into all the things that we've got planned for the next few months.
I am, and the magazine is a big one. The magazine issue 2. Which is actually very much linked to this week's episode. The feature article is the 18-year property cycle. Issue 2 is out very soon, but you've still got a chance to subscribe and make sure you get issue 2. And of course, get the digital version of issue 1 as well. But you'll get the paper version of issue 2 if you sign up quickly. You've got the 24th of this month, the 24th, to sign up to make sure you're getting that on your doorstep on time. Go to thepropertyhub.net/magazine. That's thepropertyhub.net/magazine. And get your copy. Why haven't you if you haven't already? It's absolutely brilliant. So the 24th, make sure you get it.
Yep. And as Rob says, we've had a few people ask about how to get hold of back issues. But yeah, whenever you subscribe at any point, you'll get all the old issues thrown in as well. But issue 2 is going to be a cracker. We've just seen the layouts for that today, actually. That's really, really excited about that. Let's move on, though, to our news story this week, which comes from The Telegraph. And this is a story I've picked out about commercial property. So just to link back into something we talked about a few weeks ago. And what it's talking about basically is the search for yield. And it's talking about it in the context of bonds and how bond yields are practically zero or less than zero in some cases. But commercial property, it's a reliable performer. That's why people like it. But also there are some high yields to be found out there off the beaten track. And it talks about how international investors always want to be looking at the West End of London and the City of London. That's kind of what they want, where they perceive to be safe. But if you go out to kind of like the second cities like Leeds, or it gives Stuttgart in Germany as an example as well, there are loads of really great opportunities. And I just thought it was a really interesting article to tie back into what we talked about before. And it also talks about how with a certain type of commercial property, if you let it to like a government agency or a massive company, they're never going to default and there's never going to be anything that you need to do because they need to give the property back in the same state. And so they describe it as a bond with a roof on, which I quite liked. I quite like that description. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting to get that perspective again in a sector that we don't give that much attention to.
Yeah, admittedly, Rob, I know you sent this through, but I've not read it because I've been on holiday. But I will after the podcast. But what I have read and what I am prepared for is our topic of the week. And actually, it was prompted by one of our listeners.
Yes, this was a voicemail that came our way from Matt, who had some comments to make about the 18-year property cycle. So let's hear what Matt had to say.
Hi, Rob. Just a question about your 18-year property cycle idea. It would assume if you go back in time there were property crashes in 1990, 1972, 1954, 1936 and so on through the decades. I think if you have a look at some graphs and facts from various sites, Wikipedia for example, you'll find that quite a lot of property crashes far more frequently every 2 years, sometimes every 7 years. Apparently we're in for one this year, 7 years after the great crash of 2008. So it seems a little bit unfeasible. However, if you could sort of like give some kind of evidence to make me believe that would be much appreciated, because I feel right at the moment with certainly in London, house prices seems to have some areas have doubled in just 2 years. It seems, we're in a massive bubble and it's about to burst. So please do enlighten us on this 18-year idea with historical evidence, please. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so a few gripes with the 18-year cycle there. Our mission then, Rob, is to convince Matt over the next 20 minutes. So let's get started then, shall we? The first point that he made is that has the 18-year cycle actually been present when you look at the data?
Well, let's dig in. Fred Harrison's book, who created the 18-year property cycle, his book shows the data going back for hundreds of years. But let's just stick to more recent times, because if we can't prove more recent times, then we're at a loss for everything else. So let's just have a look at the last, say, 100 years. So more recently, I think we can all say, yep, 2008, there was a crash. I don't think anyone could argue that. It's clearly there to see. And then 89, 90, there was another crash as well. Easy to document, easy to see. So in terms of two more recent crashes and following the 18-year cycle, easy peasy. But I don't think Matt's got issue with that. I think it's going back a bit further. So let's dig in. Rob, more difficult is probably, was 1980 a crash or a wobble?
Well, yeah, so we were chatting about this before we started recording, because there was a dip in 1980. And so you could say, well, that's the mid-cycle wobble, which would have been bang on time, and that's something you'd predict. Was it really a wobble? It's probably more severe than that, really. There's always a danger that when you've got a theory, you're then trying to make the data fit into your theory and manipulate things a bit. So you could say that was the mid-cycle wobble, but I don't know. If we're honest, maybe there were other things going on at the time which actually contributed to that being more severe, where property was being affected, but property wasn't the driver of that in the way that Fred Harrison talks about. So that's a bit of a could argue it either way kind of thing. Fred might say that was part of the cycle. I'm not so sure. Going back before that, though, 1972, 73, yes, there's an easy one that should have been there. So the recent evidence, very strong. Going back before that, a little bit shaky. And then, Rob, things get even tougher because there was a fairly significant global event shortly before that.
There was. I think it's worth pointing out in 1980, though, that Fred, and this is to back Fred Harrison, and this is not our cycle, so we're not defending it because, this is ours. We didn't come up with this. We are not that clever. But 1980, what you could say is his cycle, he always says that the second part of the cycle is more aggressive. And actually, if you look from 73 to 80, and then 80 to 89, 90 when the next crash was, the second half was the more aggressive part of the cycle. So you could go back in favour of that. So I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no, I think it's up for debate. 73, obviously, was a crash, that fits in. And then 56, it was a bit of a weak one, but there was a bit that happened not too long before then. But 56, I think that there was clear to see. If you look at the data, it shows growth, but there was huge inflation, so there was definitely a crash there. So 56, yes, the cycle still fits. There was something going on in the late 30s, early 40s, well, to mid-40s, which we know is the war. And then the cycle picks up again in 1930. And 1930, again, it's more difficult to assess because we don't have the house price data. What we do have is the economic data, and obviously crashes in the general economy are linked to property prices often as well. It does fit that in the 30s it could have happened. Now, we can't prove it, but we can't disprove it. What we say is it looks highly likely, but accurate, concrete data that we can go to just doesn't exist. But there clearly was an economic downturn, a huge one, which would very much fit into the cycle. So actually, if you take the war out of it, you can see the 18-year cycle goes through each one. 1980 is up for debate, whether that's a wobble or a crash, but actually the 18-year cycle, you can say, is consistent the way through. Fred Harrison does put his hand up and say, the war altered the cycle, and of course you can understand why that happened. There is a pattern there. How accurate it is up to you really to decide.
So the pattern is there, but you've got to caveat this with the fact that 18 years is always a generalization from averaging it out. We've always said at every point of talking about this that you can't set your watch by it. And the 18 years isn't really the point, and that is something that we'll come back to later. Another point that Matt makes is that property appears to crash more frequently than every 18 years. And that could be accounted for by this idea of the mid-cycle dip, which we talked about a minute ago. So the idea is that you have 7 years of reasonable growth, then a little bit of a dip, and then 7 years of aggressive growth. So you would expect to see more frequent blips in the data rather than everything just going up for 18 years, then down, and then up again. Which leads us to another point that Matt made, which was that we are apparently, you could be argued that we're heading for a crash now, and we're only 7 years on from the great crash of 2008. So what's all that about?
Well, first of all, Matt quite rightly points out that London is very aggressive at the moment in terms of its property prices, and that a crash could be on the cards. But what we have to do is look at the UK as a whole. Now, there are areas of the UK, and quite a few, that have barely reached pre-crash levels from last time. So 08 price levels, they are still not at or only just past. So we've got to be careful when we talk about a crash. Yes, London has been going bonkers for a while, but that's something we've talked about on the podcast many, many times. Now, if there is a dip, and we feel there could be one, especially in London, if there is a dip, then that would fall nicely into the pattern we've talked about with that mid-cycle dip. So I'm not going to be shocked if that does happen. In fact, I'd probably be excited because, yes, you could go, well, Rob, your assets would go down in value slightly, but it means that the cycle still continues, and we can probably then see more aggressive growth for the next 7 or so years, however long the second half of the cycle goes on for. It should happen at some point, a correction in the London market, and then surrounding areas will certainly be affected as well. But more of a dip than a crash, I suspect. We'll see. I've previously talked about China being a trigger. It could be an increase in interest rates. Greece even could be a trigger. It normally needs a trigger, though, for it to happen. It just doesn't happen because people feel like it's going to go down today. There's normally a trigger. There's normally an effect. There's normally an event that goes on to trigger this off. So that trigger could come in the next few months. It could come in the next 2 years. It's hard to predict, when you make these predictions, and we make the silly mistake of doing that regularly. When you make these predictions, it's very hard to say, okay, it'll happen on this exact date. You can make the assumption that it's going to happen, and I don't think too many people would argue with China going pop in the future. It's easy to say that. Picking a date is much, much harder. So we'll see. We'll see what happens, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a dip, and that remains consistent with the 18-year property cycle. But Rob, Matt does point out that some areas of London have doubled in 2 years, which, does seem aggressive even by the cycle standards.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't be expecting to see that if we were at this kind of midway into the cycle. Things should be at the more gentle stages by now. Things shouldn't just be going that crazy. And there are a few different positions that you could take here regarding London. So you could say that London has decoupled from the rest of the UK and is following its own cycle. London didn't really crash along with the rest of the UK as a whole. So you could argue that the timing has now shifted and we're now seeing London's winner's curse. So this is where everything goes crazy and then the music stops and it all falls down. You could argue instead that London is following the cycle along with everywhere else, but the falls are cushioned and the rises are bolstered by the intense demand that there is. So that demand means that, okay, when everything goes wrong financially, yes, London will be affected to some extent, but when things are going well, London booms more than it otherwise would. So it's just basically the same cycle, but magnified. Or you could go to one step further from that and say that because it's a global city, there is a certain geographic area, there's all this economic activity and all these jobs and everything else. London is totally disconnected from the cycle because the market isn't freely operating. It's in parts not a property market anymore. It's a global store of value. And in a world where there's lots of insecurity in lots of countries with lots of very rich people, and there's not a lot that you can actually invest in that's going to be safe and give you a return, people are just kind of dumping their cash in London, and it's not really a free property market. It's also not reliant on finance in large parts as well, which is a driver of the cycle. So you could argue that London is totally disconnected. So you could say that London's following the cycle. You could say it's following a different cycle. You could say it's following no cycle at all. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm not convinced that we're seeing cyclical behaviour in London. Because, like I said, the cycle is determined partially by affordability, but there's enough global money that affordability doesn't matter anymore in certain London markets. It's not that I'm saying that prices are never going to fall and you should buy in London because they'll just keep going up forever. That's clearly not going to happen. But it could be like a situation like you get in Manhattan in New York, where prices go up and down, sure, but they're always going to be pretty high because of the geographic constraints, because of its nature as a global city, and because people want to live there.
Okay, so where can we go with this? Well, the 18-year cycle, we've talked about it a lot, and rightly, because it's nice to have a guide, but you can't use it as this is exactly what will happen. I think, and I'll just speak for myself, I do believe that there is a pattern, and I do believe that you can use it to a degree, but you can't bank everything on it. We've always said you've got to go in for property for the long term, because if there are shorter term falls, it doesn't affect you. It's when you're gambling on the property prices going up all the time over the short term to reach your goals that you're going to get in trouble. The UK property market as a whole is cyclical, whatever the time period. That means that during your period of ownerships, prices will sometimes be falling and sometimes you'll need to be prepared. We've even created a podcast on this not that long ago. It was on how to survive a property crash. We'll link to it in the show notes, which is, I should give you now, which is thepropertyhub.net/18-year scam. That's thepropertyhub.net/18-year scam. Have a listen to that podcast, go and look at the show notes, and you can go and listen to that one yourself. But you can also look around and see different stages of the cycle, and the absolute number one thing you want to be doing is avoid buying at the peak of the cycle. And knowing where the cycle is will allow you to do that. If you think prices are just going to go up forever and get scared into buying before you get priced out, you could get in trouble. But the chances are, if you're listening to the podcast, you're not one of those people. So in 8, 9, 10 years' time, when that property cycle looks like it should come to a head, if you follow the past data, those last 2 years you might want to be taking a hold. I have no idea what we're going to do on the property podcast, Rob, for those 2 years. Talk about our weeks and what we had for lunch.
Interior design tips or something?
Interior design tips. How to spend your money and invest when the crash happens. Maybe we'll become the property podcast crash podcast. Anyway, we've got a little while away before that happens. The point is, it seems like there's a long way to go for that. Yes, we are both cautious of London and neither of us are investing there right now, but there is plenty of opportunity in the rest of the country and we are both active elsewhere in the UK.
So, have we convinced you that the 18-year cycle is legit if you didn't believe so before? Probably not, because the data is not 100% bang on. We can't say, you're just looking at this in the wrong way. Your data point is wrong. If you look at it like this, it maps precisely onto it. But that's really, for me, not the point at all. If you forget the 18-year part, what the cycle does and why it's worth knowing about is that it shows that it is cyclical and it explains why. So we haven't got into what drives this cycle in this episode. We've got into it before and we get into it in the magazine, as we'll talk about in a minute. But that's its real power for me. You realise that it is cyclical and you see why it happens. And whether you buy into it fully or not, you can still take the ideas and use those ideas to make better decisions. So you don't need to have a crystal clear crystal ball and know exactly what's going to happen on a given date. You can just see what's going on in the world around you and you can make smarter decisions based on that. And that, for me, is the real power of the property cycle, and how learning about it for me has really changed the way I think about a lot of things, even though I'm not like a crazy fanboy to the extent that I think I know exactly what's going to happen in 2023 or whatever. So whether we've convinced you or not, I hope you found this discussion interesting. As always, we're really interested in your thoughts and we'd love to have this conversation continued in the Property Hub. The place to do that and the place to get all the links for everything we've talked about is at thepropertyhub.net/18-year scam.
So it's time for the resource of the week. And actually, I'm digging one out, and it's been a while. It's probably been episode 20 odd since I've done this. So it's a resource that I've been using probably for a couple of months now, and it's absolutely fantastic, especially if you like Trello. I'm not sure if you mentioned Trello before, Rob, other than every other week. But it links in great with Trello and many other apps as well. And it's a calendar app, and it's called Sunrise Calendar. Actually, Rob, you had a bit of an issue with me because I didn't push this on strongly enough on you. And now you've started using it. You're like, why didn't you make me use this? Sunrise Calendar app is brilliant. Why have you suddenly now seen the light, Rob? Why do you like it?
Yeah, you dropped it into conversation a few times, but I didn't quite realise what it did. So, yeah, Why he didn't push me, I do not know. But the great thing is that basically, if you use Google Calendar, it integrates with that and it pulls across all your events, but it also integrates with loads of other services, of which Trello is one. So as a really simple example, if you've got a Trello card which has got a due date on it, it'll take that card and it'll put it in your calendar so you can see what you need to do. So in that sense, it's bringing your calendar and your to-do list and to-dos from various places together. So it's like on your day's agenda, you can see what appointments you've got, but you could also see what cards are coming due that day, whether that's to call someone or do something or whatever. For me, it also integrates with a service called TripIt, which is a service that kind of curates all your travel information, your flights, your trains, where you're going and so on, which is really useful for me because it pulls it all in automatically so I can see exactly where I am at any given time. And got to admit, it's just got some really fun stuff, such as it chooses automatically a little appropriate icon for things. So I put in that a member of staff was going on holiday and it put a little palm tree next to the listing. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's probably makes it sound both sad, but I like that too. I've got time blocked out for lunch, otherwise I'll just work through it. And there's a little knife and fork. Yeah, there are better features than that, trust me. And it is free, so why wouldn't you check it out? So we'll link to it in the show notes. It's Sunrise Calendar app. It's absolutely brilliant. And what else is brilliant? Oh, I'm linking in well here, is our reviews and the people who leave us lovely reviews. And this week it comes from Warren. And Warren says, long-time listener, first-time reviewer, as a thank you for producing over 100 superb episodes, here is a well-deserved 5-star review. The podcast gave me the education needed to take action and purchase my first buy-to-let. I have not been able to do so without the excellent content provided. Thank you so much, Rob and Rob. Keep up the good work. P.S. listeners, make sure you check out the Property Hub too. Love those reviews when people take action. This just makes it also worthwhile. It is brilliant. Well done, Warren. You've done the work. Taking action is the hardest thing to do. I always say it, but your first investment is by far the hardest. Not because it financially, but it can be, but also emotionally. So to do that is brilliant. Congratulations.
Absolutely. Congratulations for that. And thank you so much for the review. So doing that first one is really important, but whether it's your first one or your 50th, you still need to find these properties that you're going to buy in the first place. We talk about building a team around you, and for a lot of people who aren't in a position to go around and view 100 houses a week on their own, they want to work with a property sourcer. This is something I've had a lot of questions about recently, people asking, what is a property sourcer? How do I find one? How do I work with them? That's what we're going to talk about next week, how to find a property sourcer. So hopefully if you've got any questions around that whole kind of thing, you'll hear us say things like, find a sourcer. All that will become clear.
And what else should be clear is that you should be signed up to the magazine. You've got till the 24th to make sure you get issue 2. And as we've said already, the main feature, and there's loads and loads of other content in there, but the main feature this issue is the 18-year property cycle. So make sure, if you've liked this, if you like the previous episodes on the 18-year property cycle, and people seem to, we always get emails about it, make sure you get the magazine, because it goes into so much more depth than we ever can on the podcast. And that's the whole point about the magazine. It really allows us to deep dive on these topics. We can't go on, well, we can, but you'll probably be all bored. We can't go on for 3 hours about the 18-year property cycle, but what we can do is get it down on paper and you can read it in your own time and your own leisure, and that's what the magazine's all about. So we've already had that put together. I've read the article. It's fantastic. There's loads of other good stuff in there as well. So make sure you go to thepropertyhub.net/magazine. It's £5 a quarter. If you can't afford that, then property's not going to be for you. It's a ridiculous price when you consider how much invested in property is. So make sure you go to thepropertyhub.net/magazine and get your copy now.
Yep, go do that. Go join in the conversation and check out all the links in the show notes at thepropertyhub.net/18yearscam, and then come back next week and we'll do it all again. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.